CNN's Evan Perez joins us now. Evan, you were inside of that courtroom. I have got to understand, what were your key takeaways? What was the climate like in the atmosphere in that room? What'd you see?
Well, once the former president finally got into the courtroom, that's when all the noise in the room stopped. Everybody obviously turned their attention to the former president. He was very subdued. He walked in kind of almost like a saunter and took his seat at the defense table with alongside his lawyer, John Sauer. One of the things that was noteworthy is that unlike some of the previous times that we've seen him in court, he had Boris Epshteyn in his corner. He had a couple rows behind where the former president was sitting. Also, Walt Nauta was sitting there with the former president. Again, something that we don't normally see in these cases. And so he was subdued for most of it, while Jack Smith sat just about 20 feet away from him. They didn't really look at each other, unlike some of the previous times that they've been in court together. This is obviously a proceeding where the former president didn't have to attend. He chose to attend this and obviously was paying very rapt attention. He was very focused on the arguments, certainly the beginning arguments by his attorney, John Sauer. When the government began its presentation is when the former president began, you saw a lot more activity from him. He was leaning forward, he was taking notes, he was passing notes to John Sauer. He was very, very attentive when a couple of the judges spoke. When the Judge Childs was asking questions, he seemed very, very focused on her. One of the things that I thought, what I found really interesting is that there are times where he seemed very, very much trying to portray how much he agreed with his side of the case being presented. He looked over, he nodded strongly when Sauer was talking about how the fact that the former president there was no allegation against him that any of the crimes that are being alleged against him happened outside of office. They all happened while he was sitting in office. So he nodded very, very strongly to that argument from John Sauer. And again, the room was quite focused on the former president. Even James Pierce, who is the government attorney, lawyer for Justice Department, who was making the presentation, his parents were sitting a couple rows back in the courtroom. Apparently, they've come to some of the previous arguments, appellate court arguments, including the one that Pierce argued on the gag order just a couple of months ago. So, everybody in the room waited, of course, until the judges walked out, and then the former president stood up and walked out slowly outside of the room. Obviously, this is a very momentous court proceeding today. Obviously, the constitutional questions loom very, very large, not only over this trial, but also over future presidents. And so I certainly think that he seemed to be very animated when Pierce was talking about the idea that there would be floodgates. The one sound that you just played just a minute ago, when Pierce was talking about he doesn't believe that there would be a tit for tat, the former president was firmly taking notes and again handing him off to John Sauer, his attorneys. It was a fascinating couple of hours there. I thought it might go even longer based on the previous proceeding, but it was absolutely fascinating to watch the former president sitting there watching his fate essentially being decided by this court.
Well, first, Evan, the mom in me is not going to begrudge any parent for showing up for their kid's event, whether it's a sporting event or you are arguing a consequential matter in the D.C. Circuit Court. Kudos to those parents. But I'm really curious about the note passing here. You're saying that he was passing notes to his attorney who was arguing. Were there particular moments that you saw former President Trump particularly animated and invested in handing those notes over? Were there certain argument times, immunity, for example, or when he was talking about official acts? What were those moments?
Well, yeah, absolutely. He, the idea that, for example, when Judge Pan was asking about this idea that he has to be impeached, that he has to be convicted first. Trump was taking furious notes during that proceeding, during that part of it. Again, when Pierce was making the argument about that he doesn't expect, just because the former president is being prosecuted in this case, that in the future that there will be similar prosecutions. Again, Trump furiously was taking notes. He leaned over to talk to his lawyer when, for example, Judge Henderson raised the idea that, you know, the take care clause that you guys were just discussing just a few minutes ago, where the idea that the former president, when he took office, obviously, he took an oath to take care and to make sure that the laws are executed in this country. And she said it was paradoxical that he then would be immune from being prosecuted if he broke those very laws. He leaned over and spoke to his attorneys again during that bit of questioning. So clearly he was listening very, very closely. Everybody in the room was eyes focused on him, you know, obviously to see what his reactions would be. Very unusual, obviously, to have a defendant coming to one of these proceedings. And in reference to Mr. Pierce's mom, I asked her. I said, why are you here today? And she said, you couldn't keep me away from here today. So, Mom, very, very much invested in the proceedings there today.
Moms everywhere are like, you got that right. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad you asked that question about the
Right,
notes,
exactly.
though, because that also caught my interest when Evan said that Trump was passing notes to his attorney. But Evan, you know, there were a few moments where the judges here had to repeatedly follow up with their questions or rephrase them for Trump's attorneys. I mean, what were their facial expressions? What was their kind of body language during this?
Well, certainly, I think, you know, they were trying to hew very close to their arguments. They were trying to make sure that they didn't stray very, very far from the arguments. And one of the things the government points out is that Trump and his legal team, they've evolved a little bit in some of their arguments. And so certainly I think, certainly for Mr. Sauer, as soon as he hit the podium, he started getting questions from Judge Childs, from Judge Henderson. So he didn't even have a minute, really, to start doing his presentation. It's always very fascinating to watch the lawyers who prepare for days and days and weeks, right, to do this presentation. And then they come in here and it's rapid fire questions from these judges who don't really have that much patience and don't really pay attention to the clock either. And so that was, I think, you know, always unnerving for any lawyer, but these guys seem to be rolling with the punches.
There was a part, I mean, during the conversation, and it was Judge Pan, and she asked about a quote from Donald Trump in the congressional record. Let's put on the screen. She says, "Sorry, but there is a quote in the congressional record in which your client said, through counsel, no former office holder is immune from investigation or prosecution." I'm wondering what Donald Trump was doing when receipts were provided in the courtroom.
Those were that was one of the few moments where I saw him just stare straight at the judge. He didn't really have much of a physical reaction. You know, there are times where he purses his lips. It's one of his mannerisms that we always observe, especially when he doesn't like something. He purses his lips and looks straight ahead. And that was one of those moments, very characteristic of the former president. You know when there's something being said that he doesn't like, and that's one of the tells.
And I'm just guessing Jack Smith was pretty stoic throughout.
Right. Jack Smith was sitting just a couple rows behind Pierce and the government table. He came in with about 20, a very large entourage, about 20 people, various Justice Department lawyers, other staffers, FBI people who are working on this, part of this investigation. So he walks in and you know, for a while, as we were waiting for the proceedings to begin, Smith was looking around at some of the portraits. Like, as you know, that one courtroom has portraits of some of the judges who have sat on this appeals court in the past. And so he sort of familiarized himself with some of the people on the walls there. He did stop to talk to the Pierces, to the mom and dad who were sitting just a few rows back. So he had a little chat with them, but stoic, didn't look at the president, the former president, unlike in previous times where we saw them sort of exchange glances very, very shortly, very briefly. That didn't seem to happen today, not that I could see.
Evan Perez, from what you did see, it was quite a lot, quite interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.